Sir, I'm going to need to see some ID. This is a restricted area and visiting hours ended 2 hours ago. The voice belonged to Officer Derek Walsh, 24 years old and 6 months into his first security job at St. Mary's General Hospital. He stood blocking the hallway, his freshly pressed uniform still creased from the package, his hand resting with practiced authority on the radio clipped to his belt. The overhead fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across his young face, highlighting the serious expression he'd been practicing in mirrors since his first day on the job. His black combat boots gleamed with fresh polish, and his security badge caught the light like a shield of newfound authority. Thomas Mitchell, 79 years old and dressed in simple khaki pants and a worn brown cardigan that had seen better decades, paused mid-step. He held a small plastic visitor's badge in his weathered hand, the kind that hospital volunteers wore, though the photo was faded and the edges frayed from years of use. His silver hair was neatly combed despite the late hour, and his pale blue eyes held the patient expression of a man who'd spent decades dealing with bureaucracy in all its forms. A worn leather satchel hung from his shoulder, filled with books, magazines, and crossword puzzles for patients who had no one else to visit them. The hallway stretched behind them like a sterile canyon, institutional green walls lined with patient rooms, each door marked with numbers and medical charts in plastic holders. The air was thick with the smell of disinfectant and the underlying scent of human suffering that no amount of cleaning could entirely mask. The low hum of medical equipment created a constant background symphony. Ventilators breathing for those who couldn't, heart monitors tracking fragile lives, 4 pumps delivering hope 1 drop at a time. It was nearly 9 p.m., well past normal visiting hours, and the corridor was mostly empty save for the occasional nurse making rounds, their soft-soled shoes squeaking against the polished linoleum. "I'm a volunteer," Thomas said quietly, holding up the badge with the same careful dignity he'd once used to present surgical credentials. His voice carried the slight rasp of age, but remained steady and calm. "I've been visiting Mr. Rodriguez in room 314. He's a construction worker who fell from scaffolding 3 weeks ago, broke 3 ribs and his left leg. He's been asking for someone to read to him, the newspaper mostly. He wants to keep up with his baseball team while he recovers." Walsh barely glanced at the badge before shaking his head, his jaw set with the rigid certainty of youth. "Volunteer hours ended at 8 p.m., sir. Hospital policy. No exceptions." He stepped closer, using his 6'2" frame to loom over the elderly man. "And I'm going to need to see a current photo ID along with that volunteer badge. We've had issues with people using expired credentials to gain access to restricted areas." Thomas reached slowly into his back pocket, his movements deliberate and unthreatening. The simple gesture revealed hands marked not just with age spots, but with the faint white lines of old scars, thin surgical cuts from accidents in operating rooms decades ago, and one deeper mark along his thumb from a scalpel that had slipped during a particularly difficult procedure. He produced a worn leather wallet, its edges softened by decades of use, and extracted his driver's license. The wallet briefly fell open, revealing other cards, a Veterans Affairs medical card and what looked like an old military ID. Walsh examined the driver's license with the exaggerated thoroughness of someone still learning to wield authority. He held it up to the light, compared the photo to Thomas's face, and even checked the expiration date twice. "Thomas Mitchell," he read aloud, as if speaking the name might reveal some hidden truth. "Says here you're 79. That's pretty old to be wandering around a hospital this late, don't you think?" The condescension in his voice was thick, each word dripping with the assumption that age automatically meant confusion. "Maybe you got confused about what time you were supposed to be here. It happens to people your age. Memory isn't what it used to be, right?" "I wasn't confused," Thomas replied, his tone remaining even despite the implied insult. A flicker of something, perhaps disappointment, passed across his weathered features before disappearing behind his mask of patience. "Mr. Rodriguez has been having trouble sleeping since his accident. The pain medication helps with his physical injuries, but it doesn't address the nightmares he's been having about the fall. The doctors suggested that friendly visits during evening hours might help with his anxiety and depression. I've been cleared for after-hours volunteer work for the past 3 years, ever since I started coming here regularly. Walsh's expression hardened, his young face settling into lines that made him look older than his years. This old man's calm was beginning to irritate him in ways he couldn't quite articulate. In his brief security career, first at a shopping mall and now here, he'd found that most people backed down when confronted with official authority. They apologized profusely, made excuses, shuffled away with their heads down like scolded children. This elderly volunteer was doing none of those things, and it made Walsh feel somehow diminished, as if his authority meant nothing. "Well, I don't know anything about special arrangements," Walsh said, his voice rising slightly with frustration. "What I know is that visiting hours are over, and you're in a restricted area without proper authorization from my supervisor. I'm going to have to escort you out of the building." He reached for his radio with a decisive motion. "This is Walsh in the ICU wing. I need a supervisor up here for a security issue." Thomas glanced toward room 314, where a faint light glowed under the door, like a beacon in the antiseptic darkness. Through the small window, the silhouette of an elderly man could be seen sitting up in bed, staring at the ceiling with the hollow-eyed expression of someone wrestling with demons only he could see. "Officer Walsh," Thomas said, reading the nameplate with careful attention. "Mr. Rodriguez is awake. He's been having nightmares about the accident. He keeps reliving the moment the scaffolding gave way. His family can't stay with him because they're working double shifts just to pay for his medical care. His daughter Maria works at a textile plant during the day and cleans offices at night. Sometimes all he needs is someone to sit with him for 20 minutes and read him the sports scores. It helps him remember there's a world outside this room." "That's not my problem, and it's not yours either," Walsh replied, though something in Thomas's voice gave him pause. There was no pleading, no desperation, no attempt at emotional manipulation. Just a matter-of-fact explanation delivered with the quiet conviction of someone who'd spent a lifetime making decisions based on what was right rather than what was convenient. "My job is hospital security, not patient therapy. If this Rodriguez guy has problems, he can talk to the doctors tomorrow during regular hours." The radio crackled to life immediately. "Walsh, this is Supervisor Martinez. What's the nature of the security issue?" Walsh keyed his radio, his eyes never leaving Thomas. "I've got an elderly male in the ICU wing. Claims to be a volunteer, but he's here after hours. He's refusing to leave voluntarily and keeps making excuses about patient relationships." He paused, then added with smugness, "Might be experiencing some confusion due to his advanced age." "Copy that. I'll be right up." While they waited for the supervisor, Thomas stood quietly in the hallway, his hands clasped behind his back in a posture that spoke of decades of military bearing. He didn't fidget or argue or try to explain himself further. He simply waited with the infinite patience of someone who'd spent countless hours in operating rooms, where silence often meant the difference between life and death. His attention occasionally drifted to room 314, where Mr. Rodriguez continued his sleepless vigil, and to other rooms where patients struggled through their own dark hours. Other hospital staff, nurses, orderlies, a young resident making late rounds, passed by and nodded respectfully to Thomas, some even stopping to whisper quiet greetings. "Good evening, Dr. Mitchell," murmured a night shift nurse. "How's Mrs. Patterson in 308 doing with her recovery?" It was clear that many people knew him, that his presence was not unusual or unwelcome. But Walsh, determined to assert his authority, dismissed these interactions as mere politeness. Supervisor Martinez appeared at the end of the hallway, a woman in her 40s with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who dealt with every conceivable hospital crisis. She'd been working at St. Mary's for over 15 years, had seen the hospital through budget cuts and expansions, and, most importantly, she knew the people who made it function. She walked with quick, efficient steps, her keys jangling softly on her belt, her radio crackling with the constant chatter of hospital operations. "What do we have here?" she asked Walsh, though her gaze lingered on Thomas with growing recognition. There was something familiar about the elderly man's bearing, something that tugged at her memory from her early years working the day shift. Elderly volunteer claims he has after-hours privileges, Walsh reported officiously, straightening like a soldier. No proper documentation to support his story. I found him wandering the ICU wing well past visiting hours. When I asked him to leave, he became non-compliant and started making up stories about patient relationships. He gestured dismissively toward Thomas. Honestly, I think he might be experiencing some age-related confusion. He doesn't seem to understand that rules apply to him. Martinez looked at Thomas more carefully, her eyes narrowing slightly as memory began to click into place. The bearing, the calm authority, the way other staff members had nodded to him with genuine respect rather than mere politeness. "Mr. Mitchell?" she said, her voice carrying uncertainty that quickly shifted to recognition. "Tom Mitchell?" The change in her tone was subtle but unmistakable. The professional distance dissolved, replaced by something that bordered on reverence. She'd heard the stories, of course. Everyone who'd worked at St. Mary's for more than a few years had heard about Dr. Mitchell. Thomas nodded slightly, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Hello, Maria. It's been a while since we've run into each other during evening shifts." His voice held the warmth of familiarity, the easy recognition of someone who'd been part of the hospital family for years. "How's your son doing at Florida State?" Pre-med, if I remember correctly. He was thinking about specializing in emergency medicine. The personal question, delivered with genuine interest and perfect recall, hit Martinez like a revelation. This wasn't just some confused elderly volunteer. This was someone who knew her, who cared enough to remember details about her family, who belonged in these halls in ways that went far beyond any security clearance. Walsh looked between them, confused and increasingly uncomfortable. "You know this guy?" Martinez's expression had completely transformed. The professional mask slipped away, replaced by something approaching awe mixed with deep respect. "Officer Walsh," she said slowly, choosing her words carefully, "this is Dr. Thomas Mitchell. He volunteers here 3 nights a week, has for the past 5 years. But before that..." She paused, as if searching for words adequate to describe what she was about to reveal. Before that, he ran the trauma surgery department at Walter Reed Army Medical Center for 23 years. The words hit Walsh like a physical blow, each syllable carrying weight he was only beginning to comprehend. Walter Reed. Even with his limited knowledge of military medicine, the name was legendary. It was the Army's premier medical facility, the place where the most critically wounded soldiers from every conflict had been brought to fight for their lives. And this quiet old man in the worn cardigan had been one of the doctors responsible for saving them. "Dr. Mitchell," Martinez continued, her voice taking on the tone of someone delivering a crucial lesson, "holds the Bronze Star with valor for his service during the Gulf War. When casualties started pouring in from the front lines, Dr. Mitchell volunteered to deploy with forward surgical units. He spent 6 months operating on wounded soldiers under combat conditions, sometimes while the base was under active rocket attack." She looked directly at Walsh. "He saved over 300 American lives during that deployment alone. After he retired from the Army with full honors," Martinez went on, "he spent another decade as chief of surgery here at St. Mary's. The after-hours volunteer privileges aren't just a courtesy, officer. They're a recognition of his decades of service to this hospital, to the United States Army, and to the thousands of patients whose lives he's touched. When Dr. Mitchell retired from active surgery 5 years ago, we didn't want to lose his expertise entirely. The volunteer program was specifically modified to accommodate his schedule and his unique qualifications." Walsh felt the blood drain from his face, leaving him pale and shaking. The magnitude of his error was beginning to dawn on him with crushing clarity. He'd just accused a decorated Army surgeon, a man who'd saved hundreds of lives under enemy fire, of being a confused elderly wanderer. "Dr. Mitchell," Walsh stammered, his voice cracking. I didn't know. I mean, how was I supposed to?" The words tumbled out inadequately, hollow and embarrassing. His carefully practiced authority had crumbled entirely, leaving behind only a young man who'd made a terrible mistake. Thomas held up a gentle hand, stopping the young officer's fumbling apology. "You were doing your job, son," he said, his voice carrying no anger, no vindication, just the patient understanding of someone who'd spent a lifetime teaching young people to do better. "Hospital security is critically important. You saw someone in an area where they shouldn't normally be at an unusual hour, and you followed protocol. That's exactly what you should have done." Martinez stepped in, turning this into a learning opportunity. "Officer Walsh, Dr. Mitchell has a special identification badge that marks him as an after-hours volunteer. It's different from the regular volunteer badges." She pointed to the faded ID in Thomas's weathered hand. "See that gold stripe along the edge? That indicates extended access privileges. It should have been covered during your orientation training, but I'll make sure you get a refresher on special credentials." Walsh stared at the badge, seeing for the first time the small details he'd dismissed in his rush to assert authority. The gold stripe was there, barely visible against the faded plastic, but unmistakably official. "I'm sorry, Dr. Mitchell," Walsh said, his voice thick with embarrassment and genuine remorse. "I made assumptions based on nothing but ignorance. I was wrong to question your mental state, wrong to treat you like you didn't belong here. You've earned the right to be in these halls more than anyone." Thomas smiled, an expression of genuine kindness that transformed his weathered features. "We all make mistakes, Derek. The important thing is learning from them and growing. This hospital sees hundreds of people every day, patients, families, staff, volunteers. Sometimes the person who looks least important turns out to be exactly who's needed most." He glanced toward room 314 again, where the faint light still glowed. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I believe Mr. Rodriguez is waiting for someone to read him the sports section. The Yankees won today, and I know that'll help him sleep better tonight." As Thomas walked toward the patient's room, Walsh watched through the window as the elderly patient's face lit up at seeing the familiar figure in the doorway. For the first time in hours, Mr. Rodriguez smiled, and Walsh understood that he'd just witnessed something far more important than hospital protocol. He'd seen what real service looked like, delivered quietly and without expectation of recognition or reward.